Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Antiracism Book Club.
Yes.
So we're still reading from Ibram X Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Yes, and we're really excited about this episode. It's a lot of meaty chapters that we're going to be exploring today. So starting off with chapter 10.
Yes, let's get to this then. So with chapter 10, the main 2 points that we want to cover here is looking at anti-white racism, actually defining what this actually is, and exploring the fact that racist power is not actually the same as just saying that defines white people.
Yes.
It's very common that we try to associate the two, and Professor Kendi does a really great job of trying to separate them as two separate groups.
Yes.
So moving on from this then, definition of what it means to be an anti-white racist. This is one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, or conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. So they're very, very different things, and you can't actually say that someone, because they're white, therefore has racist power over others. And obviously it is straight up racism if you are saying that one group is inferior to another. And in this case, with anti-white racism, it's referring to people of European descent as being actually inferior.
Yeah. And so just a couple of points to make on this anti-white racism. One of the things that Professor Kendi starts with, that both Gyles and I think when we read it, we're like, ooh, truth, is that racist ideas love believers, not thinkers. So actually, whenever we're not allowing ourselves to be critical about some of the ideas that we have, whenever we're thinking to ourselves, oh, I'll just set up my belief system based on somebody else's experiences, that's when racist ideas are so much easily spread to other people, because actually it's this whole concept of, oh, all white people this, all black people this, all Latino people this. This is immediately goes into the field of, actually, you're not a thinker, you are then a believer of what other people are telling you. And then there's quite a long discourse on the Nation of Islam and how they kind of perceived white people. And so the Nation of Islam was particularly prevalent in the 1950s, 1960s in America, still ongoing now. But one of the things that they were saying was that pretty much white people are almost like the incarnation of the devil. They were looking at all the atrocities that were happening around them, with lynchings and obviously mass incarceration and slavery and all of that had happened. And they then therefore postulated that actually all white people must be biologically, genetically, culturally, behaviorally inferior. They must be devilish in this sense. And this is where Professor Kendi is very clear in saying, actually, that is not the case. That is not true. And I also believe that there was a conversation with regards to Malcolm X and how his ideology kind of moved from Nation of Islam, where he was like, yes, all white people are the devil, I completely believe this, to then actually questioning himself and denouncing the Nation of Islam, because he realized that all these ideas were very were very racist. And that wasn't something that he wanted to be known for.
Well, it's not a defining feature of Islam, really.
Exactly.
If you actually just believe that one group is better than another, you are being a racist.
Exactly.
And this is not a tenet, it's not a pillar of Islam in the slightest. It promotes actually for us all to try and live as best a life and respect everyone for who they are. So I'm glad to see the Nation of Islam has moved away from that sort of messaging. But it is the truth that was being suggested as a real truth. It was the same being suggested as a real truth back in the day. We need to move away from these racist ideas.
So the thing is, I'm not sure whether the Nation of Islam has moved away from it. It was just very clear that Malcolm X had moved away from the Nation of Islam.
If I'm honest, I'm not all clued up with what's happening with the Nation of Islam these days, but I'm led to believe that there has been a shift where you can't just be purely racist against all white people. That's not part of the solution, is it?
Yeah, it isn't at all. Okay, so then we move on to the next element. And hi, Megan, so good to see you and have you here with us. Yeah, would love to you to send us your comments, your questions, whatever they are. And so yeah, moving on to the next element of actually racist power does not equate white people. And these are some things that we've already kind of explored. So one of the ideologies is that obviously there are anti-racist whites and there are also racist non-whites. There is a difference between racist power and white people, and actually white people also lose out to racist powers. And these are things that Professor Kendi made very clear in the book, with regards to the fact that actually racist power focuses on self-interest. Yes, racist power is often white, but white people are not always power players and racist power. And there's a quote here that really exemplifies that we want to share. And so he mentions in this book that going after white people instead of racist power prolongs the policies harming Black life. In the end, anti-white racist ideas, in taking some or all of the focus off racist power, become anti-Black. In the end, hating white people becomes hating Black people. And then it continues with, in the end, hating Black people becomes hating white people. And then there's another quote on white supremacy that we found really powerful that kind of ties this in as well. The fact that actually white supremacist is code for anti-white, and white supremacy is nothing short of an ongoing program of genocide against the white race. In fact, it is more than that. White supremacist is code for anti-human, a nuclear ideology that poses an existential threat to human existence.
Yeah, it's really strong words that Professor Kendi actually has in his book, and it's one of the things that actually kind of makes it quite challenging. Is that he is very, very deep and he's very, very strong in what he's saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I can't disagree with him.
Yeah, there's so much that he unpacks in this, which is absolutely crazy, and so much that we don't necessarily in everyday conversations hear or experience or explore. And I think that's one of the reasons why we really enjoy reading the book, because it's teaching us so much. But yeah, so Megan, you mentioned about it depends on what part of Islam, you know, in terms of the ideology, and with regards to the Nation of Islam, we were talking about that. Yeah, it really depends, and I think we might have to educate ourselves a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think the main thing from my own understanding, I was born and raised in East London, very large population of people from Islam there, and you know the root normally of Islam, if you try and see different ways or different streams of it, is that generally speaking, it's about peace. It's about trying to live a good life. It's not about trying to see one people as being better than others. That's what's supposed to be the truth of pretty much all religions, generally speaking, is what can promote people to actually live the best life as possible. But as we know, there's been people from all faith backgrounds to some extent who have used religious texts, used religious doctrine to justify killing, harming, maiming people. Yeah. And but I don't really believe any God would tell you to do that. Definitely my God doesn't tell me to go and kill people.
So yeah, so we're moving on to, and yeah, Megan, you mentioned about the interesting take on white supremacy. Again, yeah, it's not something that we often hear. And actually to say white supremacy is anti-white is very controversial, because most people think actually white supremacy is almost the epitome of pro-white.
Why would it be anti-white? Why would you?
I think one of the things that Professor Kendi mentions is the fact that actually white supremacy is about keeping racist power at the top rather than white people in general. And so if we're looking at only keeping a segment of the white population at the top, ultimately it is communicating that not all white people matter, you know, not all white lives matter, only specific white lives matter. And therefore, you know, in general, white supremacy actually is anti-white, but it's also looking at how white supremacy is anti-human, because we know that in terms of the doctrines and things like that white supremacists hold on to, it's kind of looking at if you are Black or non-white in any way, you are not worthy, you are not worthwhile, which means that they are in a way disregarding so much of what makes up human life and humanity. And ultimately, because racist powers are not the focus of white supremacist attacks, ultimately, racist powers are not for people. Racist powers are for a person, a particular class
a very
of people.
small group, and we'll be talking with regards to
Class,
with chapter 12, which goes into this topic a lot more. But you know, this is what I like as well about Professor Kendi's book, is the fact that every chapter does build on the previous one.
Definitely.
Be it his own personal story that he will comment on, which we don't actually cover that much when we're going through our recordings. But you know, he has his own personal dialogue, which is going through, generally speaking, in chronological order. And it's just a very well written book. The definitions as they build, and so we will be touching upon this topic actually of how racist power actually still harms a lot of white people. Not as much as harm given to non-white people, particularly black people, but they still get harmed nonetheless. So moving on then to chapter 11. So in chapter 11, we move on to the topics rather, of powerless defense, black on black racists, and that racist black police and policymakers, you know, they have a role to play in the whole fight for anti-racism. So a definition here on what it means, that the powerless defense. So this is the illusory, concealing, disempowering, and racist idea that black people can't be racist because black people don't have power. And you know, just with a little bit of common sense, really, we know that black people can ascend to very powerful positions in society. Barack Obama was president of United States, arguably one of the most powerful countries in the world. Normally you're seen as, if you're president of the United States, you're president of the world, pretty much, type thing. So, you know, this idea that you can't actually be racist because you don't have power, we need to smash this one. And Kendi goes in great detail into explaining this point.
And I think whilst we are also kind of bringing things up, Megan, we'd love to hear from you as well. We know that obviously you have a unique experience in the sense of growing up in South Africa, and actually seeing where black people are in governmental positions, are in positions of power, how that plays itself out on an everyday basis. But while we wait for kind of your comment to come in, you know, as Gyles has said, yes, black people can be racist. So whenever we're talking about racism and people are saying, well, black people can't be racist, they can, because black people do have power, even if it is limited. And actually, if we say that black people can't be racist, then we're also saying that black people cannot be effectively anti-racist, because to be anti-racist is to oppose racist ideologies, to oppose racist policies. So if you negate the fact that black people can be racist, you also negate the fact that black people can be anti-racist.
I think the other thing to keep in mind as well with this idea of black people being racist, that it's got nothing to do with power. Like, there's white people, as we'll come to in chapter 12, where you're seen as a lower class. You're seen as someone who actually doesn't have power, but you still subscribe to racist ideas. Racist ideas have nothing to do with power. It's completely down to a belief system. Do you choose to believe in a racist idea or an anti-racist idea? But it's this idea, though, that actually, because you don't have power, that you can't be racist. That's what's mainly being tackled here. And as Vanetta said, black people can effectively be anti-racist as a result, because they're choosing not to do anything. So just in picking this a bit more, there's a quote that comes here that every single person actually has the power to protest and anti-racist policies, to advance them, or in some small way to stall them. So this is like quite important point, the fact that we can choose to do something just as we can choose not to do something. And that actually is a demonstration of power. Is that we have free will, we have the ability to actually do stuff that we think is either right or wrong, or what we consider as neutral, but neutral in this sense is still kind of wrong. Like if you do nothing, you're going to allow, racist policies, racist ideas to exist unchallenged.
To continue unchallenged. And that was obviously one of the first points that Professor Kendi made in the book, that you cannot be neutral. You are either racist or anti-racist. There is no middle ground. So if you cannot be racist, like it kind of puts you into a gray area that just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And yeah, Megan, you were saying that coming from South Africa, it's probably a totally unique situation, which is complex. Yeah. And what the rhetoric that you've heard most recently is the fact that you cannot be racist towards white people. And that's such a lie, because you can. Racism in and of itself doesn't have color attached to it. It has to do with how you perceive another human being. So it doesn't matter what color you are. You can be racist towards the other person that you are seeing and perceiving and interacting with.
Yeah. And Megan, you've put down a really great point about the fact that there are actually some racist policies in place in South Africa. Technically, they're racist policies which are trying to undo the harm and the great suffering that's come from apartheid, but they're still racist policies that are against white people. So, for example, you have to have a majority black board in order to have a company in South Africa, which in some respects can make sense, because what if, the fact that most people in the country are black, how can you not have a majority black board? But what if you're actually got 2 people in the company? You suddenly have to bring in 3 more people who may never have been involved in your project, just to show that actually you can have more black people represented in businesses. But that's not going to solve the problem of the education that people need to have in order to have a successful business.
Yeah.
It's not going to change, the fact that some people just simply don't have the aspirations to run their own business, let alone how to successfully run it, because they don't know anybody. So they're then, forced into positions somewhat to try and bring about change. And I think a lot of reasons why these racist policies have been adopted in South Africa is because there's still a lot of pain and anger and suffering that's come. What really needs to happen is actually a proper plan of action on how do we provide the education, the support, so that there's an equal playing field, rather than just, tip the scales in the opposite direction. Because let's be honest, there's still a huge amount of wealth that's held by the white minority in South Africa. You don't want to get rid of them. You want them to actually stay loyal to South Africa, which from my understanding, my personal experience is, regardless of color, South Africans are proud to be South Africans, even the racist ones, funnily enough. But you want people to actually see, well, how do we actually now work together to move forward, rather than how do we just shift all the power towards black people? What we really need to shift to is a position where all South Africans have the power to, be self-employed, or to get a good education, get a great job, to actually live to an old ripe age with good health care. There not being health inequalities. We're not having people living in shanty towns and the like.
Yeah. And this is the thing, it's about moving away from the tokenism. And I know, Megan, you've mentioned that, tokenism of, okay, let's just do the reverse of what was done before.
Yeah.
And actually looking at, okay, true anti-racists work with strategy and look at how can we bring equity, not and a reverse racism as such, but how can we bring equity? Because any policy that brings about equity is anti-racist.
Yeah.
But any policy, it doesn't matter in favor of whom, that in some way introduces or exacerbates inequity among the races is racist.
Yeah.
And that is what people need to realize.
I think the thing to keep in mind is that racist policies actually have taken a long time to develop. Like, generally speaking, they never happened overnight. Like, when we look at the slave trade, it wasn't like one day there was no slavery and the next day there was. Like, there was huge amount of planning to go into creating the transatlantic slave trade. So this whole idea of, well, let's just have policies that are now in favor of black people just to reverse what's happened from racist policies, you're not going to see the true manifestation of equality from just having racist policies put in place to favor a different race that was previously oppressed. What you need to do, as Vanetta said, is have these anti-racist policies, which are going to take time. Like to actually see the manifestation, the fruits of educating Black people to a standard that a lot of white people historically around the world are having. And then those children becoming adults, or those adults actually having education and then can put it towards new jobs that are now available for, that they're actually skilled for. This takes years, can take a generation, but it's constant effort from the top down and from the bottom up. And people are not patient enough for that.
This is it.
You know, and I can understand that. I can understand the fact that, particularly when I reflect on South Africa, there's people that lived through apartheid, that they actually saw their relatives being beaten, being judged as colored, or certain people just because of them being slightly lighter, and depending on the temperament of the person seeing them, they will say, you know what, you're white today. And the next day, someone else will see, you know what, you're colored, which dramatically, like, completely shifts the way that person can survive and be treated where they are. And this is a serious problem, that those people that had to suffer that, had to witness that, they are feeling pain, and they will even pass on that pain to their children sometimes. You can't guarantee that. We will be like, well, apartheid's gone, so let's just be positive. Like, there's a lot of people that want revenge. I'm not saying it's right, but I can totally understand why they will have that view. And so I think that's partly what has then led to a lot of racist policies in favor of Black people to then be adopted in South Africa, is that we want a result quickly. And it's just not as simple as that.
It doesn't, it really doesn't work like that. And I like what you said, Megan, with regards to, it's not about disadvantaging white people, it's about empowering Black people. It's about leveling the playing field. It's not about creating a new playing field, a new hierarchy, a new, way where there's a top race and a bottom race. That's really not what it's about.
That doesn't work.
But so we have a quote here again from Professor Kendi that kind of highlights this evolution of anti-white racism and black on black racism as well. And it says, racist ideas are constantly produced to cage the power of people to resist. Racist ideas make Black people believe white people have all the power, elevating them to gods. And so Black segregationists, so as a reminder, segregationists are those that believe the races can never come together, that there's always a superior race. Black segregationists lash out at these all-powerful God as fallen devils, as I did in college. So this is Professor Kendi talking. While Black assimilationists, so those are those who believe that inferiority and superiority is temporal, and you just need to assimilate to the superior culture. While Black assimilationists worship their all-powerful white angels, strive to become them, to curry their favor, reproducing their racist ideas and defending their racist policies. And this for us, this is a powerful quote from our perspective, just looking at actually how Black people can respond differently to racism. And you've touched on that, Gyles, where on the one hand, you go to the point where you're like, no, white people are the worst, they are the devil, they are the ones that we need to come against, and therefore, we are the superior race, and Black people or non-white people are the superior race, and we need to suppress them, parts of which is happening in SA right now. Or you go along the lines of, oh, white people are the reincarnation of Christ, so let us move everything and change our whole persona and being to become like them. Whereas anti-racist appreciates that there's differences between every race, that there are racist white people and racist Black people, and anti-racist white people and anti-racist Black people, and so on and so on. Yeah. So then the next element in here, and this is a good segue into actually Black on Black racists, this quote that we just read about, Black segregationists, Black assimilationists leads to Black on Black racists, which is also something that is definitely actively there.
Yeah, and I would say that the root of this is ultimately that there is a divide, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter. There's a divide in class, or at least a divide in how people are viewing themselves. So you get kind of this view of black elites, or people who are aspiring to be black elites, and those who are defined as the black poor. So, you know, black elites would be those who are in a middle income or higher. The fact that they've perhaps got at least one university degree, if not multiple, you know, that they're married and there's not as much chance of divorce, things like that. And the black poor is seen as people, they're not working, they're not educated, they come from broken homes. And then people are aspiring to be amongst the black elite, but they don't want to be part of what's being defined as the black poor. But, you know, as we'll talk later on, you can't see it as black elites and black poor. It's just there's elites and there's poor. And even then, there shouldn't have to be this divide between elites and poor. It should really just be humans, full stop. And we have a few examples that go into this point of, you know, people who perhaps have power, and they use that power to support racist ideas or even create racist policies against black people deliberately. Like, it's not that there's harm to black people by consequence and it wasn't intended. We're talking about deliberately trying to harm people who are black but seen as the black poor, that we don't want to be like them. They're not part of us. We don't want to be a part of them because that makes us look bad. It's a way of stepping backwards. And even more further in how this can manifest into people just rejecting even being black, quite frankly.
Exactly.
So the first example then we'll go into, if you want to go into that, Vanetta, about Ken Blackwell.
So the first example is Ken Blackwell, and he was known as the Ohio Secretary of State in the lead up to George Bush's presidential election in 2004. And this was something that really shocked us when we were reading it. But so Ken Blackwell is black. But in the way, Ohio was one of these crucial voting grounds to decide who then becomes the president. And often Ohio is more democratic leaning. I think that was the case. And actually, through Ken Blackwell's, I want to say reign, but that sounds really, but it kind of, the way it's been described, when he was in power as Ohio's Secretary of State, he ensured that there was such a great voter suppression that kind of almost directly targeted black voters, because black voters were known to be generally more pro-democratic than they are pro-Republican. And so to ensure that Bush won, Blackwell put policies into place that misinformed, lied to, and suppressed black voters. So there were instances, for example, where Congress people were telling prisoners they're not allowed to vote, although actually those prisoners were allowed to vote. So that was suppressing their votes. They were they didn't put enough voting booths into the democratic areas of the state. So people would wait in queues for hours, whereas in other states, white people would never wait that long. But black people would vote in queues for hours. And actually that, because they obviously had jobs, kids, whatever else, they would then leave those queues and not vote. And that meant that Bush, I think, won by something like 117,000 votes, when in one state only, because of the tactics that Ken Blackwell used, over 140,000 people did not vote.
So basically, it came to a point where the tens of thousands of votes that actually helped Bush win, high chance that would never have happened if there wasn't so much voter suppression. And it could only be seen from certain evidence that Kendi was presenting that actually Ken Blackwell was just doing it for his own good, like to help him.
Because when it comes around, he was then also crucial in Trump's presidential election, because the Trump's team recognized how influential Blackwell was in getting Bush into the White House, because of the power, the limited, but the power that he used to suppress black voters, that they wanted him back when it came to bringing Trump into the White House. And these are the stories that we don't hear, we don't read about, and so we assume black people are completely powerless and black people cannot be racist. But actually, this is a very clear example of where someone has abused their power or has just aligned with racist policies.
And it's a big problem, this, because voter suppression, like, I can never really see why it would be a good thing in the era of democracy, why you would not want to allow someone to vote. It can only be because you're trying to stop someone from winning, or you're trying to encourage someone else from winning.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite terrible to see that. So then the next example is actually William Hannibal Thomas. So this is not such recent history.
Yeah, this
is in the 1800s, was it?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to just go through that as well then, Vanessa?
So William Hannibal Thomas, he was a light-skinned black person, and we've already spoken about colorism in previous chapters and how there's how racist you can be within your race, how you can be colorist within your race. So he was a light-skinned black person, and he was desperately also trying to establish this whole concept of, I am not your average black person. I'm trying to remove myself from the black people. And they would actually use the N-word. So you would say there's them N-words, and then there's us, the black elite. And so William Hannibal Thomas was part of that. And he actually wrote a book called The American Negro, in which he went into gross detail about the fact that actually the black person is biologically inferior, the black person is stupid, the black person is lazy, any stereotype.
Mentally retarded, immoral savages, unable practically to discern between right and wrong. 90% of black women are in bondage to physical pleasure. The social degradation of our freed women is without parallel in modern civilization. And one of Thomas's biographers concluded that Thomas's list of negative qualities of Negroes seemed limitless. Like he pretty much just hated black people, and because of him being light-skinned, he wanted to see or at least demonstrate that he was not black, that he was actually someone who perhaps had evolved, who had transcended all these negative, terrible qualities of what it means to be black. And but there was a lot of black people that made it quite clear that what he's saying is nonsense. White people kind of agreed, and he actually died a janitor. Like he was really trying to make a name for himself. And,
as someone who hated his own race.
And actually he got rejected by the very people that he wanted to be accepted by. And then he actually had nobody in the end. Racism ultimately isn't leading to the best of lives, to be honest with you.
Being racist, and so this was just kind of a historical snapshot, and Ken Blackwell being a more recent one, but there's even more recent incidences. And Megan, you also mentioned, things about happening at voting polls, voting stations. This is everyday life. This is everyday life. And we're talking about, the next point that we were talking about is racist black police and racist policymakers, because that's kind of evolved kind of out of this whole concept of black on black racism. In the 1960s, government started to, or states started introducing more black police officers in a hope to kind of combat the racism that might have been
throughout the judicial system.
Exactly. There was black lawyers, black judges, black Supreme Court, whatever. So many more black people in positions of power. And yet actually, especially when it came to black police officers, right in the beginning, there was actually quite a lot of people who were complaining against the abusive black police officers, that they were just as racist as the white police officers. If not worse.
Sometimes they would prefer to have a white police officer deal with them.
Exactly. But again, it's because just because you're a police officer doesn't make you exempt from being racist or anti-racist. Just because you're a black police officer doesn't automatically make you anti-racist. Because what if you're a black police officer who in his mind has the whole idea of, I am better than the majority of my race, and therefore I will treat you like the dirt I believe you are. That. So no wonder that didn't necessarily make a difference. And one of the things that came out was that actually there were black or non-white police officers involved in well-known killings of people, such as Sandra Bland, such as Michael Brown, such as Terence Crutcher. So we can't say, oh, white police officers are racist, but the black police officers that are involved or standing by or part of this are anti-racist. That makes no sense. We need to recognize that these police officers have power, had power, and use that power to not dismantle the racism that was before their eyes, because actually they probably believed in it as well.
Yeah.
And this all kind of points to the whole concept of rendering Black people powerless is refusing to hold them accountable for their racism.
Yeah.
If we're saying Black people have no power whatsoever, then whenever they're being racist, we're saying, actually, no, it's not racist, when it is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Yeah. And there's a wonderful film, if you haven't already heard of it, directed by John Singleton, Boys in the Hood. So it's a 1991 film. I'm trying to remember who else was in it. So
Cuba Gooding
Jr., Ice Cube. There's a few people that was in this film. Lawrence Fishburne. And why I give reference to this film is that there is actually, not to do too many spoilers, but there is actually a Black police officer in there who is a really good representation of what Vanetta's just been explaining. The fact that they have strong racist ideas that are against Black people and can be very racially abusive to other Black people that they're supposed to be serving.
Yeah.
And it's really painful actually when you see that, because even though it's a film from 1991 and it's a dramatization, it's based on truth. Like it's based on realities that I would presume that most of the actors in that film have either experienced personally, or they have experienced from others who have experienced it. And it's still an issue literally happening probably right this moment.
Yeah.
As I say these words,
yeah,
it's still an issue happening now.
Yeah.
And I would love to see a day when we don't have to face this anymore, but it's a painful truth, unfortunately.
Yeah. Megan, you made the point saying, I think people hold police officers to a higher standard and forget that police are still human and still come to the job with all their history, prejudice, etc., etc. And I completely agree, but at the same time, I feel like we do have to hold them to a higher standard. I think anyone who in their profession is able to give sentences over life and death over people have to be held to a higher standard.
Yeah.
You have to go through equality and like, how common is it that a lot of people go through equality and diversity training, you know, and so this is something that's like so common knowledge now in a lot of workplaces. Yeah. But actually, if you're a police officer, if you were a judge, if you were a lawyer, if you, like I said, anyone who, even doctors, nurses, whatever, anyone who has the ability to actually decide between the life and death of a person needs to be held to a higher standard.
Yeah, that's right.
There shouldn't be an excuse. There shouldn't be an excuse. It's understandable when they kind of miss that, but it shouldn't be an excuse, really and truly. Yeah, and so we then went on to kind of, well, Kendi went on to make more points with regards to racist policymakers. Do you want to touch on that?
So, you know, there's so many policies that have been put in place, which apparently has been trying to make lives, particularly of Americans in the case of Kendi's book, highlighting the lives of Americans to be better because of the problems that are coming from, you know, poor Black people, or, you know, people always doing all these crimes. And there's so many times that policies have been put in place that are not seen as true public health crises, but rather an issue that's associated with Black people. So, for example, heroin crack problems that was on a rise before the millennium, still an issue now, but it was a dramatic rise before the millennium. You know, they had to put in policies to deal with the heroin and crack, rather than seeing, well, this is a problem that could be affecting any race. Like even me as a doctor, when I was taught about heroin, I would be told that if you thought someone had taken heroin or been snorting crack, most of the time they're going to be perhaps a banker, middle-class white man from the inner city. That's what we're taught when we're learning medical school in East London, in the United Kingdom. So this is something that people need to keep in mind, that issues with drugs, issues with a lot of problems with crime and burglary, this comes from all races. It's got nothing to simply do with color. It's actually more often associated with poverty.
Yes.
You know, the fact that we're getting so many people in prisons is highlighting that had there been issues of poverty addressed, then people would get better education, they were able to have jobs, and they're less likely to turn to crime. You can't just say it's because they're black why they're being criminals. It's because they're black and the policies that you have in place that's oppressing black people, making it harder to get the good education, to actually have the good job, to actually be seen as equal, that it happens that they will then turn to crime. And the other thing to keep in mind with this is that if your neighbor happens to be black, of course you're more likely to burgle them because they're the one that's closest to you. And as we'll talk more in chapter 12, you know, black people tend to only exist with each other, particularly if they're of a low income. So because of that, you're going to see this so-called black on black crime. But it's not as simple as that. These black people just want to attack black people. It's the fact that some of them, they just don't have any other way of trying to earn that money and to survive. And it's down to these policies. Is there anything else you want to add here, Vanetta?
I think it's the whole concept of, and Professor Kendi talks about this previously, spoke about that previously, but this whole concept of whenever we ascribe the behavior of a group to individual traits, we are walking on very unsteady grounds. Because if a group behaves in a certain way, it is more likely because it's the system that it's around. If an individual behaves in a certain way, fair enough, that might be their character trait. But we can't keep saying, oh, black people, there's a lot of black on black crime, there's a lot of heroin and crack issues. This must be because black people just have addictive character traits or whatever. Like, there should always be a deeper analysis and more of an insight into why is this happening? Why is this happening? And again, it's looking at the class divide as well, which we'll talk about in a moment, because one of the things that was a shock to me is that the rise in mass incarceration was actually partly fueled by black people trying to do their utmost to save their neighborhoods. But in the attempt to do this, they were looking at, oh, it's the black poor, it's the N-words that are causing issues to the neighborhood. They weren't looking at what are the policies that are causing these people to almost be in a perpetual cycle of lack of resources, lack of education, lack of employment, all of these kind of things. So we need to really challenge our own thinking and challenge our own perceptions whenever we say that a group, whenever we attribute a group conditions to individual character traits rather than systems.
So moving on then to the last chapter, which is on class. So here there's three main areas that we're going to address. So class racism, actually defining that, looking at the talented 10th, and then racial capitalism. I think, like, probably apart from chapter 1, which dealt with definitions, and then chapter 2 following up with defining
consciousness.
There's a concept that Kendi talks about within chapter 12, known as the conjoined twins, but we'll come to that in a moment. But it was really, really profound. I think it really just sums up how, you know, racism is just,
it's so complex.
It's not just complex, it's one of the worst things that we face in this day and age, because actually, and we will talk about this shortly, it is amongst some of the worst causing atrocities in the world. So let's first go into actually defining class racism. So class racist, this is one who is racializing the classes, supporting policies of racial capitalism against those racial classes, and justifying them by racist ideas about those race classes. So do you want to just explain what that means with an example, perhaps, for now?
Yeah, so racializing the classes, basically saying that, all poor people are black or all rich people are white. That would be racializing the classes, because you're attaching a race to a class system. But it's also, when he says supporting policies of racial capitalism against those race classes, it's anything that is helping continuing to feed into the system that keeps black people poor and white people rich is class racist. And then justifying these policies. So, you know, you've put things in place. So for example, you know, you've given employment to white people, you've not given employment to black people, or the other way around. But you're saying that's because white people are genetically superior to black people. White people are genetically or intellectually superior to black people.
Yeah.
Those would be racist ideas about those race classes.
Yeah, just highlighting that, you know, if black people aren't actually able to have the jobs, it's because they're just not working hard enough. They're not trying hard enough to get those jobs. These are racist ideas and are hallmarks of class racism.
Yeah.
So then looking at what does it mean to be an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, is quite simple. It's one who is opposing racial capitalism. So we will be unpicking this in more detail about the fact that actually capitalism and racism do go hand in hand. But it's really unpicking what capitalism is, because a lot of people think, well, capitalism is what life needs to be.
Yeah.
And actually it doesn't, because of the fact that it is so linked to being racist and linked to racism in general.
Yeah.
So I'm picking this. There's a quote that we want to read, which highlights the fact that, you know, this issue of classism really is even going down into our vocabulary. Do you want to expand on this, Vanetta?
Yeah, so I'll go into with a quote first. So the word ghetto, as it migrated to the main street of American vocabulary, did not conjure a series of racist policies that enabled white flight and black abandonment. Instead, ghetto began to describe unrespectable black behavior on the North Broad streets of the country. So again, this whole concept of ascribing group behavior to a particular race, saying that, oh, the ghetto equates black behavior, rather than looking at what were the policies that actually developed ghettos. These were the policies of where white people were historically allowed to, or subsidized to, move out of the urban areas into more of the suburbs. And then all the resources followed that white flight, as it's called. All the good education, all the good jobs, whatever, followed in the direction of where the white people were moving to, leaving the urban areas without resources and leaving them sometimes over-policed. And so we have a creation of a ghetto because of policies. But when we hear the word ghetto, or often when we use the word ghetto, we ascribe it to the behavior of a group.
Yeah.
And this is the problem. And when we drill more into the concept of class racism, we look at the fact that actually it is the intersection of racism and elitism. It's about, you know, signifying the ghetto black and the white trash, which are both terms that are at a cross section of racism and capitalism, at a cross section of racism and class.
Yes.
And we are not recognizing that actually economic disparities and differences are based on policies, not people. The reason why the ghetto black is the ghetto black is not because they have behaved in a way that has made them ghetto, but rather they have been put into situations where they've been put into ghettos.
Yeah, if there's any behaviors that they're demonstrating, it has been a reaction to the policies, to the environment that has been, you know, consciously at times, consciously created for them, which means that, you know, they've got very limited opportunities. So it's not because they want to talk a certain way, they want to eat certain food, they want to live a certain life, they want to have certain jobs or no jobs. It's because actually the policies that's been put in place has cultivated that. Yeah,
exactly. And the same goes for people who are, you know, where the term white trash is used, which is also such a terrible term to use. But you talk about maybe potentially people living on trailer parks, growing up on trailer parks, and having families that are all kind of in that connection. It's all about, actually, it's not about the passing on of white trash, but it's actually what are the systems that continue to be perpetuated that allow for people to live in those circumstances. So again, it's about the fact that pathology is not in the is in the policies, not the people. We need to stop diagnosing people with pathological labels, social pathological labels, but instead look at the policies that are fueling what is happening. Yeah, and then so the other point in this was about welfare and nepotism, which I thought was such a powerful point. The fact that they are actually two sides of the same coin. And there's a quote here that we want to look into. Do you want to read that?
Yeah. So something was making poor people poor, according to this idea, and it was welfare. Welfare transforms the individual from a dignified, industrious, self-reliant, spiritual being into a dependent animal creature without his knowing it. This came from US Senator Barry Goldwater.
And it continues, the quote continues to say, Goldwater and his ideological descendants said little to nothing about rich white people who depended on the welfare of inheritances, tax cuts, government contracts, hookups, and bailouts. They said little to nothing about the white middle class depending on the welfare of the New Deal, the GI Bill, subsidized suburbs, and exclusive white networks.
And then finally, welfare for middle and upper income people remained out of the discourse on handouts, as welfare for black poor became the true oppressor in the conservative version of the oppression inferiority thesis. So it just highlights, from these three quotes, the fact that Kendi's just spot on, the fact that actually, if you keep seeing black people as just being poor because they're black and not because actually you are, as a particular power group, seeing that you've put in place policies that makes it almost impossible for someone to have a better life. You can't just see it that actually these people aren't good enough. Is that you've put in place a policy that makes it difficult to even prove that you're good enough.
Yeah, exactly. Whilst putting in policies in place that support the rich, that support those at the top. And yeah, so next on, we're moving on to a point with regards to still looking at actually the class, the black elite, and how this concept of the talented tenth is one that is well versed when it comes to African American studies. So W.E.B. Du Bois coined this term in 1903, and it basically was relating to racist black elites, because it spoke about the fact that actually 10% of the black population are exceptional, and this 10% will be the saviors of the black race, because change and transformation can only come from the top down. That was Du Bois' thinking in 1903, and that was something that
assimilationist view as well. Like
exactly.
The fact that, well, we'll have these black people that are showing this is the best way to be, civilized, and then you'll become like us, and then you will no longer be inferior. You'll actually join us in this better position.
Exactly. Again, not challenging the policies behind what was keeping so many black people back. But Du Bois changed his mind. So, he did realize the racist root of what he was saying, and actually began to realize that actually capitalism has a lot to do with racism. And this is our kind of final point for today that we're going to explore and dig into.
Yeah. So it is impossible to know racism without understanding its intersection with capitalism. As Martin Luther King said in his critique of capitalism in 1967, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated.
So that's a powerful quote. And we were like, oh, where's he going with this? Because I don't know about you, but for me, in terms of how I was raised, capitalism was never seen as a bad thing. Communism was the bad thing. That was the witch hunt.
Exactly. You're against democracy. You're against people being able to have great wealth and have an amazing life. Everybody has to, suffer and, be eating out of tin cans. It's such a terrible sort of view that people are having of communism. And in having communism seem so bad, it then emphasizes a view that capitalism must therefore be perfect.
Exactly. And capitalism is kind of the beauty of capitalism is that you can just, as long as it is the American dream, is to work hard and you can do whatever you want in your life. But it's kind of like, it doesn't work that way. It's not that easy. And you mentioned the part of conjoined twins. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
The conjoined twins, as Kendi puts it, is the link between racism and capitalism, and he explains that there's quite a long history of how these are combined. Because if you think about it, even just logically, based on very simple reflections, racism is led to the slave trade. You had to actually believe that one group was inferior for you to say we're going to enslave them, and say that they're worth so little compared to us. They don't have the intellect. All these negative qualities that you associate with them. But the reason why you were even doing the slave trade was so that you could be rich, so that there could be a group who are very wealthy, and that would mean that there will have to be people who work for you, who have to really struggle and actually be part of a group of people who will never actually attain the wealth that you have. And that's often what is associated with capitalism, that there's going to be people who are not just striving to be in a better place, but people who are suffering in their pursuit of being in a better place. And so ultimately, if you want to be anti-racist, you need to be anti-capitalist at the same time. So we're not saying that you shouldn't feel that being rich, trying to have great wealth, you have to get, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, or working hard isn't a bad thing. This is the thing. It's not about anti-capitalist doesn't mean that you say that people are allowed to exploit welfare, people are allowed to be lazy or whatever else. That is not what it's about. It's not about saying that wealth is wrong, but it's about clearly stating that wealth on the backs of others is wrong.
Yeah.
That actually, how can we say it's a free market when sub-Saharan or the global South doesn't have the same access to the market as the global North does?
Yeah.
Well, how can we say that it's fair trade when actually the people who are pocketing most of the profit aren't even the people who are working on the resources and bringing out the resources? That is where he's talking about being anti-capitalist. And here there's some stats that we found absolutely mind-blowing. And sad, to be fair. And so one of them is related to the fact that white families are have 10 times more of a net worth than black families. White families, and this is obviously, these are American stats, but white families are expected to own 86 times more wealth than black households this year. In 2020, the majority or the average white family is expected to own 86 times more wealth than black households in 2020. And that just makes me think, okay, so something must be wrong here. Because you can't tell me that every single black family represented in this study is lazy. Every single black family represented in this study doesn't have ambition. Every single black family is stupid. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So when you look at stats like these, that should be challenging us and making us wonder what is going on. What is the bigger picture? What is happening? And then we've got the stats that the top 1% of the world own 50% of the world's wealth. How is that a free market? How is that fair trade?
Yeah.
This is where we're talking about actually capitalism is also racist and racism is also capitalist. And we to be anti-racist means to be anti-capitalist. And Megan, I love what you said with regards to you and Dom having become more and more minimalist, because it lends itself more to being more anti-capitalist. Yeah, recognizing that as we pursue resources, as we pursue status and status symbols, it is often going to be a racist pursuit, because the world has been set up in such a way where the economy is racist, and the economy is capitalist, and the economy is racist. And again, so the final quote, the final stat that I was just like, this is mind-blowing, is that 70% of the world's working age population owns only 2.7% of global wealth. That's 3.5 billion people only own 2.7% of the global wealth. Like, how?
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. I'm just picking some stuff as well that I've gone back to from the book, just highlighting that, when could working people compete equally with capitalists? When could black people compete equally with white people? When could African nations compete equally with European nations? When did the rules not generally benefit the wealthy and white nations? Humanity needs honest definitions of capitalism and racism based in the actual living history of the conjoined twins, which is that of capitalism and racism going hand in hand. And it's this point that people just don't seem to realize, is that it's not as simple as just saying that, well, it's white people that are just racist and they're capitalists. It's much more complicated than that, but there is a correlation with capitalism, with a 1% of the population of the entire world having so much wealth to the detriment of so many other people. And racist ideas, racist policies are maintaining that, if not encouraging it.
Exactly.
When it's like, well, we're going to reject climate change, we're going to give more tax breaks and more benefits to companies that are supporting climate change, in the sense of they're ones who are actually aiding the climate change through coal and other non-renewable resources of energy. You're seeing the rich being taxed less. You're seeing atrocities happening in Congo, meaning that such a ridiculously wealthy country is just, for lack of a better word, being raped.
Yes.
Like, you're just stealing what's precious for the benefit of yourself.
Yeah.
And not for mutual benefit of those who are able to take what's great, and to give appropriate, compensation to those who you're taking from.
Yeah.
And it ties into our final quote then, for today, which is, racial capitalism makes countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo one of the richest countries in the world below ground. So the natural minerals and stuff that is growing underground, and one of the poorest countries in the world above ground. And there's some serious atrocities that's happening there, and particularly this as a plug to look into Save the Congo, which is doing a lot to counteract a lot of the issues that's coming from the dictatorship and the atrocities happening in Congo. So to love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. Very powerful words from Kendi.
Yeah, very. Yeah, and I'm perturbed by all the things that we've discussed, all that we've read, all that there's so much to think about, and I love how you kind of thrown in minimalism, Megan, because that's something that I've reflected on for a while as well, and the fact that actually, do we need as much as we need? Because what is the cost? What is the real cost? I'm not talking about the financial cost. What is the human cost? What is the relational cost? What is the racist cost to it? These are things that we so often don't consider because we never see them connected. We think racism and capitalism are two different things, but literally, as you said, they as Kendi so powerfully put into an image, they are conjoined twins. They are together. They will always be interlocked together because the one furthered the advancement of the other. The slave trade furthered the advancement of colonies. Industrialization furthered the advancement of cheap labor and things like that. There's always, whenever there is a dehumanizing taking place, it benefits those that are at the top of the hierarchy. They will dehumanize those below them for the sake of growing in wealth and growing in resources. And that's shocking. That's absolutely shocking. And very sobering.
Yeah, there was a quote, I forget the gentleman that was given the quote, and I think it might have been Hidden Colors 2. So Hidden Colors being a series of documentaries that are talking about racism. This is quite older. I want to say a good 5-6 years ago this could have even come out. And the gentleman said, if you really want to mess with the white man, mess with his money. And what he was highlighting here is the fact that actually that's what is driving the white elite, if you want to call it a white elite, this group that are supporting racist ideas, which are definitely harming a lot of white people as well. But as soon as you do something that can harm the ability for them to have money, something that could slow down the generation of wealth or remove some of their wealth, suddenly policies have to come into place. Something has to change to maintain that wealth. And we need to address this. We need to address this because it's not about having money that's the problem here. It's how people are going about it. It's definitely more complicated than just saying that it's white people that are doing this, because there's people of all colors, of all races, that are doing their part to actually maintain some of these racist ideas and racist policies for their own gain.
And even if we look at the African continent itself, so many of the countries are independent, have claimed independence from being colonies, and yet they are in such a bad position because they've either sold their country backhand through foreign investments, which pretty much is the same like having a colony, just in more acceptable terms in this day and age, sold their country into foreign investments, or black politicians benefiting from aid money or whatever that's coming into the country and not letting it go to the places it's actually needed in. So again, racist power are fueled by self-interest, and racist powers can have any color under the sun.
That's right.
Any color under the sun. And we need to challenge ourselves in thinking, okay, how does anti-racism affect our everyday life? How can we show ourselves to be for racial equity? How can we show ourselves to be for humanity? How can we show ourselves to use the power that we have, whether it's limited or not, to ensure that it's anti-racism that is proliferated and not racism?
Yeah. So again, Professor Kendi, I've got to give thanks to what he's been writing in this book. Chapter 12, by far, some of the strongest stuff, really thought-provoking on this link between racism and capitalism. What this can look like for people who actually need to be anti-racist. It means you need to be anti-capitalist. Doesn't mean you're anti-generating wealth. It's just, what are you going to do to allow that wealth to be generated?
And what are you going to do with it after you've generated it?
How are you going to keep it to be a level playing field for everybody, regardless of race? So yeah, this has been episode 4, Antiracism Book Club. Thanks again for joining us.
Yes.
And we look forward to joining you for the next episode.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Take care. Bye.